Well, hello out there, real country. It is high noon. You're listening to WMOQ 92.3 on your FM dial, and that means it's time for the Marc McMain Show. He says, I'm Bob Furr here, though, filling in for Marc. Marc is out campaigning for that seat for the Georgia State Senate, and we wish him well in that. I've been listening to those election ads and such like that. You know, the one thing that comes away from it, I'm going to not say anything one way or the other here, but I will say this, and that is, if your political ads, whether you hide behind somebody else paying for them or not, are about what's wrong with your opponent, then, and you don't have anything right about you to say, then you're not getting my vote, plain and simple.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Negative advertising. That makes me just want to turn the channel when I see that.
It really does. And so we learned about this, right, George? In our first episode, we're doing our Tuesdays 250 by 50 segment here, walking through American history, or better said, America's story, 50 years at a time, leading up into the 250th America 250 July 4th holiday. And we're just letting America's story unfold. And in our last chapter, we ended it with, the George Washington leaving office and warning us against political partisanship and political parties.
Wow. Imagine that.
Yeah, and foreign entanglements. So he sure got it. So, hey, before we get off on this installment of Tuesdays 250 by 50, I want to talk about some events coming up in the area. There's one that really caught my eye. This Friday is the last Friday for something at Hard Labor Creek State Park called Friday. It's a Go for a Glow hike. And it's a firefly walk through the park. Now, they're not just any fireflies. They're synchronous fireflies. They're a rare species, which mean they flash their bioluminescent lights all in perfect unison in coordinated bursts of 5 to 8 flashes, and then there's several seconds of darkness. And the males do this during mating season, which is right now, ending right about now. That's why it's last Friday, so they can stand out to females and prevent confusion with other firefly species. Wasn't aware, Paul, that there were other firefly species.
No,
I thought they all just kind of came one size fit all. But they call it the breathing forest because you just see these thousands of flashes of lights and dark and back and forth. The forest kind of breathes with this alternating light. So it's a moderate to strenuous nature trail. You learn all about fireflies, nocturnal life, the ecosystem. It just sounds to me like a great family outing. And again, this Friday coming up is your last chance. Pre-registration is required. You can explore that at Georgia State Parks, gastateparks.org, and just navigate either the Hard Labor Creek State Park or the Glow for a Hike, or you can just give them a call at 706-557-3001. If you're looking to get outdoors with the family this Friday, looks like a fun and interesting family thing to do.
Yeah, for sure.
And then in Madison, June 18th, Summer Nights kicking off, Town Park, a band called the Squirrelheads. Now, that name caught my attention, so I did some research. The best thing I can do to describe the word for the Squirrelheads is the word funky. Like, if you look up the definition of funky, it's unconventional, offbeat, or stylish in an eccentric way. And this band, they got their name from the traditional old-time music, an Appalachian fiddle tool called Squirrelheads and Gravy. And that's where they got their name. But they play the feel-good sounds in New Orleans. It's a combination of funk, boogie-woogie, and Mardi Gras music. I saw them online. They've got all kinds of instruments going on, guitars, brass, an accordion, even a wearable washboard that they're playing. They've been around for 25 years. It says to beg, the promotion for it says it begs for you to get your tie-dye out of the T-shirt. You got any tie-dye in your T-shirt?
No,
there?
for a long time.
I got one I got from Woodstock 94 that I might have to bust out for this. So anyway, that's June 18th in Town Park as they kick off their Summer Nights series on select Thursdays in Town Park in Madison. Kicks off at 7 p.m. It's free. All you got to do is show up. You can get more information at madisonga.com or go to the Main Street Madison, Georgia Facebook page. And that's what we got coming up.
How about that?
All right, so let's get into part 2 of our Tuesdays 250 by 50 series. Part 1 was how America came to be, the first 50 years, and really before that, because we started with the colonial period, but 1776 to 1825. And what we talked about was how you can really see the origins of America today right from the start in colonial America, and that road that led us to independence. And we also talked about how having a specific birthday, July 4th, 1776, really makes us unique in the world. And also what makes us unique is just how quickly we caught up with and overtook the other nations of the world. I use the analogy, the freeze at the Atlanta Braves game. We were like the freeze coming out of nowhere and catching up and caught that. And so this defined point of origin that we have as a nation and this compacted sense of history that it took us to grow and develop really kind of makes America unique in our core national identity. And I use the analogy, and I'll use it again because the more I looked into it, the better it was, is a baby giraffe. It's the perfect visualization of America's birth. So first of all, when a baby giraffe is born, it drops to the ground from its mother on its feet. So kind of like we entered the world from England right into the American Revolution. The baby giraffe then immediately starts trying to walk in order to avoid predators, stumbling around, trying to find its way. And that really kind of compares to us stumbling our way through the early years, the American Revolution, under threat right away from Britain, and then being able to defend our independence once we gained it. Then after stumbling around, within 30 to 60 minutes, the giraffe is walking. They're able to walk. And within just an hour or two, they're pretty steady on their feet. And so you look at America stumbling through the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution. The Constitution finally gave us something to stand on. And within 10 hours after a baby giraffe is born, they're able to run at full speed. And really, we were running at full speed pretty quickly after that. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here on Real Country 92.3. Bob Furr filling in for Mark here on the show on Tuesdays. And we're doing a special series here called America 250 by 50s as we're walking you through American history. Now, I don't believe in coincidences. We're going to get into this next decade here, Paul. I don't believe in coincidence. I'm a man of faith. I believe everything happens according to God's plan. So I'm going to call this first event of this next period, 1826 to 1875, a remarkable confluence of events, which is when multiple independent factors or occurrences merge together to produce a specific outcome. So when you think of the Founding Fathers, the names don't get any bigger than John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. I don't think America happens without these two guys. Adams is the abrasive Boston lawyer. He's pushing for independence. He's like the grain of sand in the oyster at the Continental Congress, right? He's like pushing people, pushing the limits, right? Jefferson, the polished Southern gentleman, he's the one that connected independence to what the Southern ideals and interests were. And they were kind of this yin and yang that made the Declaration of Independence happen. And as a result, not surprisingly, they became pretty close friends. It didn't last, right? So after that, Jefferson became, now the country wins the revolution. They're trying to figure out what kind of country are we going to be. And right off the bat, the issue between states' rights and a strong federal government is central to all this. Jefferson goes with the way of states' rights. Adams goes with a strong central government. And so right away, they're at opposition. Now, under Washington, Adams is the vice president and Jefferson is the Secretary of State. And during Washington's 2 terms in office, they become vehement opponents against each other. And it gets personal, right? It becomes embittered. And finally, in fact, Jefferson resigned after Washington's first term over this. So now, after Washington's first terms, it's Adams against Jefferson in the next presidential election. And here's the thing a lot of people don't know. Back then, the way the Electoral College worked is whoever got the most votes in the presidential election was the president. Whoever got the second most votes became the vice president, right? And so now Adams wins the Electoral College. He becomes the president, but now his second place runner-up, Thomas Jefferson, is the vice president. And throughout Adams' first term, the two are in violent opposition to each other. Jefferson is opposing Adams at every term. So Adams gets to the second term. Jefferson now opposes him, and he wins. But the election goes to the House of Representatives because there was a flaw in the Electoral College. Adams, Jefferson, there was a tie between Jefferson and Burr, and so the House of Representatives had to decide the election. And by now, these two men are estranged, bitter enemies who have stopped speaking entirely. Okay? Here's where it gets interesting. There's another founding father by the name of Benjamin Rush, who's a dear friend to both men. And he's deeply troubled by the falling out between the two of them. And in 1809, he has a dream. True story. I swear you can't make this up. He dreams that his son is reading a book, and he asks his son what he's reading. He says it's called A History of the United States. And he says, do you want to read? He's like, no, I don't care. He's like, but you got to read about this thing I'm reading about of something that happened in 1809. And in the dream, in the book, according to Rush, his son said that Adams wrote a letter to Jefferson congratulating him on his retirement after he left the presidency, which is when he left the presidency. Jefferson replies to the letter, reciprocating feelings of regard and appreciation toward Adams, and the two begin a correspondence over many, many years. They eventually reconcile, and then the book in the dream ends by saying, until they sunk into the grave at the same time, full of years and rich in gratitude and the praises of their country. Okay? Everything I just said is a dream that Benjamin Rush had. Okay? Rush writes to Adams about the dream. He's like, this is what I dreamt. And Adams writes back like, look, I'm old, I have no ill will toward Jefferson, but it's really hard for me to write anymore, but if Jefferson writes to me, I would certainly respond and certainly write back. So now Rush writes to Jefferson and tells him about the dream, and in 1812, Jefferson writes to Adams. And true to his word, Adams writes back to Jefferson. Just like in the dream, over the next 14 years, the two men send 158 letters back and forth to each other, recounting their experiences with the Declaration of Independence and the Continental Congress, detailing their views on the new country, providing us, we still have the letters today with this unbelievable historical perspective into the birth of America through the eyes of the two men who were at the center of it through their letters. Now, to give you a sense for how much these two men came to mean to each other after they never saw each other again, but just through their letters and their writings, to give you a sense of how much they meant to each other, when John Adams died, the very last words he spoke were, Thomas Jefferson still survives. Except he didn't. Thomas Jefferson had died 5 hours earlier that very same day. That day was July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
One of the most amazing coincidences in American history.
But you don't believe in coincidences, right?
Yeah, right. I can't call it coincidence. One of the most amazing confluence of events in American history. And, just really fascinating that it went down that way. So now as America is ending and we get into its next 50 years, America is changing really across the board. I compare it to a teenager, right? This is when a teenager is, part of their life where they're really trying to define who they are and how they want to be seen by the world. And a lot of that changes because how Americans can now get around and move around things. The Erie Canal has been completed, the first major east-west route through the country. Steamboats have now become ubiquitous on rivers like the Mississippi and Ohio, and the first steam locomotives by the end of the decade in the 1820s are starting to move. So the best analogy I can give you is by the end of the 1820s, America is like the teenager that's gotten its driver's license. And now they're able to move about independently and move themselves and people and things around the country, and that's going to have a big effect on America's growth. And we'll talk more about that when we come back from commercial. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here on Real Country 92.3, a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50s. We'll be right back after a few commercial words.
Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting MadisonTrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
Hey, this is attorney Bart Bitton with Bitton & Bitton. I live and work right here in Monroe, Georgia, and I am proud to serve this area. If you've been hurt in a car accident, you don't need some out-of-town lawyer that treats you like a number. You deserve a local lawyer you can trust, someone who lives here, works here, and takes care of people. So remember this, if you're ever in a car accident, be smart, call Bart. Bitton & Bitton, local lawyers you can trust.
I chuckled at a cartoon that showed a news conference by a United States senator who announced that he was divorcing his family so he could spend more time with politics. We may laugh, but the truth is many people make that statement every day. Maybe not with words, but with their actions. In fact, if a politician retires from his work to spend more time with his family, it becomes the lead story, met with cynicism on the evening news, while the one who rejects his family advancing his career is commonplace. God tells us we should work hard to the glory of God, but He has clearly shown that we must have priorities. A relationship with God first, and family follows that. What does your focus tell you about your priorities? The Bible says that we have brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out of it. It's good to focus on the things that last, like putting God first, and then family, and then people all around us that God loves. This is Bryant Wright, speaking right from my heart.
Visit rightfromtheheart.org and click television to watch our TV spots.
I'm former Congressman Jody Heiss, and we have a critical runoff election coming up on June 16th, and I want to urge you to get out and vote for Marc McMain for State Senate. Marc is a solid and trusted conservative. He'll defend our constitutional rights, support law enforcement, and fight for Georgia families. But dark money groups are now attacking Marc because they know he is the true conservative in this race. So don't stay at home, and let's all keep the main thing the McMain thing. Paid for by Marc for Georgia Incorporated.
All right, welcome back, Real Country. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here on 92.3 WMOQ, according to the FCC. I'm Bob Furr, filling in for Marc, and we are covering a special 5-part series, Part 2, Tuesdays 250 by 50, as we are walking you through America's story up until the July 4th, 250 America 250 holiday. So now we're into the 1820s, and John Quincy Adams is now the president, the son of John Adams, and his election has been really controversial. There were 4 candidates in the election, and the one who, Andrew Jackson, won the most popular and the most electoral votes, but not quite enough to win outright. Probably something Marc McMain can sympathize with right now after the primary.
In California, they weren't holding up the election at all,
No.
waiting for votes to come in
Right.
at all.
Well, but it got very California-esque in a moment
Yeah.
because for the second time now, the House of Representatives has to decide the election, and it gets decided in what became known by the populace as the corrupt bargain. Because a guy named Henry Clay, who had been one of the candidates, pledged to throw his support behind John Quincy Adams in exchange for being named the Secretary of State under Adams. And so now, this is a big deal in America. The first 5 presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, those 4 all elite Virginia planters and gentlemen, and then Adams, a member of the elite class as a Boston lawyer. Jackson is the first commoner. Andrew Jackson's a frontiersman, vowed to fight for the common man, and so people felt like this corrupt bargain the political elite had cheated voters, and it split what was then the Democratic Republican Party, and it launched Jackson on this 4-year revenge campaign, mobilized So tell me if this sounds familiar. Like, one of our themes throughout this whole thing has been, precursors to later in history. So tell me if this sounds familiar. So this this outsider, his base gets outraged. And so in 1828, he wins this landslide victory, and that is the birth of the Democratic Party. And so now Andrew Jackson takes office in 1829 and ushered in what they call the era of the common man in this country. So now we're into the 1830s, and we're looking at Jackson's presidency. The Declaration of Independence held that America was based on all men being created equal. And it's probably the greatest hypocrisy in American history, if not the history of the world. And it's not just about enslaved people, because in early America, to be able to vote, you had to own property. Right? You had to own property. And each state set their own requirements. So between the 1790s and 1820s, the states began granting rights to non-property owners. At the same time, they were taking away voting rights from women and free African Americans, who at the time had voting rights. In the election of 1828, it's the very first time that all white males in this country, regardless of property ownership, can vote, and it represents a dramatic shift in political power. Now, a lot happened during Jackson's presidency. He's one of early Americans that you really got to take the good with the bad. He was a slave owner, and I know some people can't do that. It's okay. Welcome to America. On the one hand, he wrestled power from the political elite. He put it in the hands of the common man. On the other hand, he was a slave owner. He was the architect behind the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that set the southeastern Indians on the Trail of Tears. He forced them from their relocation in the southeast out west of the Mississippi, out to what today is the Oklahoma Territory, east of about Oklahoma City. And, on my way back from California with the trolley, I drove through that. I drove through the Muskogee Nation. And, that's about 1,000 miles away. And for them to be dislodged that far, really something struck with me. He also dismantled the second bank of the United States. We're still trying to figure out how to run our national economy here. Early America, the central bank, Jackson distrusted it. He had a bad land deal go wrong where his paper currency, they defaulted and he was left almost penniless. There was too much political influence, too much favoritism with loans. So he disbands the national bank, but it creates ripples through the economy, and now it creates opposition in what became the Whig Party. And now we have our second two-party system because now the Whig Party enters the stage. Now in the 1830s, we see the rise in organized resistance against slavery. 1831, William Lloyd Garrison begins publishing The Liberator. And then there's the Nat Turner Revolt. And this is a big deal. Nat Turner leads this revolt. 55 white men, women, and children in Virginia are killed, but less than 24 hours later, the rebellion is put down. And eventually they're all put on trial. 31 are condemned, 19 executed, 12 sentences are commuted. Now, Turner eluded capture. He get caught while awaiting and while he's awaiting trial, his confessions are recorded by a journalist and are published within weeks of his education, and that has huge ramifications. And so now you start to see movements like the Virginia governor is trying to push for emancipation. The abolitionists up north are being galvanized. And you're really starting to see, on the other side, entrenched support, a willingness to fight for the slavery institution. So now we also see at the same time what they call the Second Great Awakening. This is this big religious revival that focuses around Christianity's personal salvation story, free will. And this started in the 1790s, but it really peaks right at this time of widespread social reforms, the temperance movement against alcohol starting, prison reform, women's rights, and of course at the heart of all of it is slavery. And so now America is really, it's that teenager trying to figure out who they are and what they stand for. We stand for being the Marc McMain Show here on Real Country 92.3 WMOQ. I'm Bob Furr filling in for Marc, and we're doing a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50s as we're walking through America's story 50 years at a time. Now, there's also a period of big technological advancements here. Things we might not think of. For example, Cyrus McCormick invents the mechanical reaper. That transforms agriculture, right? That takes it from somebody behind a horse. This is now really starting to allow for agricultural on scale. Now, in 1834, the Whig Party has come into play, and they're a coalition of national Republicans, they were called, anti-Masons, and disgruntled Democrats, and what they all united around at this point was opposition to the executive authority that Jackson was using, right? Jackson had kind of figured out the powers of the presidency and the veto power and going around Congress, and so they came together. Now, meanwhile, out in Texas, new story developing there. In the 1820s, Americans had began settling in what was then Spanish territory, and they were encouraged to do so by the Spanish. And later, when Mexico gained its independence from Spain, they continued to encourage Americans to settle along the border of Texas. Their thinking was, if all these Americans are living on the border between the U.S. and Spanish-Mexican-controlled Texas, the U.S. is less likely to make a land grab, and there's less likely to be a war. But then in comes Santa Anna, right? General I can never say it right. Antonio de Santa Anna, I think his name was. There's one more word in there. I always get it wrong. he throws out the Constitution and he asserts control over Texas and begins to try to reclaim Spanish forts there that had been, kind of just occupied by the colonists that were out there at that point. And so in 1836, Texas declares its independence, forms its own constitution, and now the Texas Revolution is on. A lot of people mix up the Texas Revolution and the Mexican-American War. They think the Alamo was part of the Mexican-American War. It wasn't part of the Texas Revolution. And there's two major battles that come up with remember titles, right? Of course, remember the Alamo, and then there's remember Goliad. And in both cases, those who surrendered were executed by Santa Anna. Goliad was actually worse, but I guess Alamo just had a better ring to it, and that's what stuck. But the other thing about the Alamo is there were some big names there. Davy Crockett, Bowie, or Austin. So there were some pretty famous people there that went down in the Alamo. So Sam Houston now uses the Texas Constitution to form an army, and he attacks even though he's badly outnumbered, he attacks Santa Anna near a place called San Jacinto. And in a battle that lasted only 18 minutes, despite the fact that they were badly outnumbered, the Americans routed the Mexican army, suffering 11 casualties to 650 against the Mexicans. And Santa Anna gave up. And even though Mexico never recognized Texas as an independent nation, Santa Anna basically surrendered it. And we'll get back to that because that's going to become important in just a minute here. So now the push west is accelerating in this country. Arkansas in 1836 becomes the 25th state. Michigan gets added in 1837. Now we're up to 26 states, so officially doubled the size of the number of states since the Revolution, and has done so in a period of just under 60 years, And now we see the first mapping of the Oregon Trail, the first route out to the Pacific Ocean, trying to be able to move large numbers of people across the land that had been explored by Lewis and Clark. Now, in 1837, Jackson is succeeded by Martin Van Buren, and immediately there's a financial panic that year. Now, Van Buren continued Jackson's resistance to the National Bank. He favored an independent federal treasury, which is now becoming a really big issue in this country. He continues the Indian removal. He resists Texas statehood. Now, the minute Texas became independent, it wanted to join the country. A lot of people, they think the Republic of Texas, we were our own country. Texas, like day one, wanted to join the United States, but they didn't want to admit Texas because they feared, number one, it would cause a war with Mexico, and number two, it was a slave state. That had been a big part of the whole issue with Mexico and leading to the Texas Revolution, and they didn't want to let in that big of a territory and state in with slavery. Van Buren also navigated some border disputes. Great Britain still has a foothold in Canada. So even all these years after the Revolution, right, we're still trying to define our northern borders against England that we'd fought in that war with. But he really reinforced the Democratic Party, right? So he carried along Jackson's policies, and he really reinforced the Democratic Party. And this is the point in American history when we really start to have a well-established two-party system that would exist for the rest of our being as a nation. He loses after the first term over his handling of the economic crisis. But he also loses because it is the nation's very first catchy political slogan. It's called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And William Henry Harrison was a general during the War of 1812, and before that, he had won a major battle against Native Americans, and based on that battle, he'd been given the nickname Tippecanoe, and John Tyler was, of course, his vice president, and so William Henry Harrison takes office in 1841. To have the shortest presidency in U.S. history. And we will talk about that when we come back from our commercial break. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show on WMOQ, Real Country 92.3 on your FM dial. Bob Furr filling in for Mark, and we will be right back.
The Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting madisontrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
Is technology giving you a tough time at your home or business? Don't worry, Big Mountain Computers is here to help. We're your local tech experts, now open in Madison. Our white glove service ensures personalized solutions for all your IT needs. Hardware fixes, remote support, private lessons, and more. Visit us at Madison Plaza across from Ingalls or call 706-343-4184 to schedule your consultation. That's 706-343-4184. Big Mountain Computers, turning your mountains into molehills.
Stripling's General Store in Bogart reminds you that Father's Day is June the 21st. And you know dear old Dad would love a gift from Stripling's. You'll find great gift ideas, from gift boxes full of Dad's favorite things to gift cards. Fire up the grill with a juicy cut-to-order steak from the meat department. Plus, you'll find all the side dishes that make Dad's Day a special day. That's Stripling's General Store, Highway 78 East and Highway 53 in Bogart, wishing all dads a happy Father's Day.
If you're in the construction business, you're going to need a dumpster at some point in time, and that's why you need to call Atha Equipment Rental in Monroe, now offering 20 and 30-yard cans. Atha Equipment Rental now offers a complete line of landscape and construction equipment like tools, trenchers, floor sanders, jackhammers, and so much more, like rentals for your parties with tables, chairs, popcorn machines, Dunkin' booths, and more. Call Jason Atha at 770-207-6041. That's Atha Equipment Rental on East Spring Street in Monroe.
Welcome back to the 1840s on the Marc McMain Show. I'm Bob Furr, filling in here for Marc on Real Country 92.3 with a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50. So I'm walking you through American history, American story, 50 years at a time, leading up to the big America 250 4th of July celebration. And before the break, we were talking about William Henry Harrison taking office. His presidency is defined by the longest inauguration speech in U.S. history, and longer than Trump's longest inauguration speech in history, yet and followed by the shortest presidency. And the reason his presidency was short, as I look through this, as you think about this point in American history, there's three things that come to mind. Number one is life is hard. And when I say life is hard, I mean staying alive is hard, right? Like survival is still a primary concern for most Americans. Second of all, the political divisions that we think we invented today, that Washington warned us way back in 1790 about, are already unfolding. And here's where we see really the precedents being established along these lines. So Harrison gives this 2-hour inauguration speech on a wet and cold day in Washington, refusing to wear a coat and top hat. And so he gets sick. 3 weeks later, he gives another long outing in the cold weather without a jacket. He gets pneumonia, severe diarrhea, and just 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison dies in office. Now, interestingly, back to the point about staying alive, recently historians have come to believe that the real cause that he died was not pneumonia from being out in the cold, which we've thought for all these years, but actually septic shock caused by drinking contaminated drinking water in the White House, contaminated by raw sewage in Washington, D.C., right? So back to that thing. Now, he gets succeeded by a guy named John Tyler, and John Tyler is now the first vice president to assume the presidency. And up until this point, the idea was if that ever happened, that the VP would really just kind of be a caretaker. And Tyler says, no, he is the one who establishes the full power precedent of becoming vice president, which we would see unfold later in history with Johnston and Johnson and other presidents who succeeded their president. He also is the first one to really make use of the presidential veto. And so now Tyler is really doing a lot to overcome political gridlock, using executive power and establishing executive power. So, for example, he vetoed legislation to revive the National Bank, and when he did, his entire cabinet resigned, and he got expelled from the Whig Party, right? So we did not invent the political craziness by any means. Now, the 1840s are all about the push west. In 1841, 80 pioneers became the first organized wagon trail headed out to Oregon and California on the Oregon Trail. And by 1843, it is on. What they called the Great Migration is underway. About 1,000 people completed that 2,000-mile journey. And now, for the first time, the route west is not just for trappers and Lewis and Clark and explorers. Entire families are able to relocate their lives and move to the west. He resolves that U.S.-Canada border dispute that's still going on with England at this point. He also signs a treaty in 1884 that establishes trade relations with China and establishes ports in the Pacific. So now, for the first time in the South Pacific, you've got America exerting influence. Let's see how that turns out about 100 years later, because part of that is asserting America's interests in Hawaii. Right, and so obviously that's all going to come back about 100 years later. 1845, Florida joins the Union as the 27th state, and then right before he leaves office in 1845, Tyler, who's not running again because he didn't get his party's nomination, triggers what is, to me, the biggest, most underrated event in American history, because he annexes Texas into the Union as the 20th state. And what he does is he bypasses the treaty process to get it done. Now, in 1845, a conservative editor had written about the idea of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny was an ideology, a belief in this country that America pushing west was our God-given right. It was God's destiny that we fill the continent in between. And 1845, James Polk is fully committed to manifest destiny, and he starts one war, and that war that he starts contributes to an even bigger one. So in 1846, probably the most significant decade of the entire time, maybe one of the ones in American history, it's the Mexican-American War. So after Texas becomes a state, there's the dispute with Mexico about how far does it extend. Does it go to the Rio Grande, or Mexico felt it was a river farther north? And so Polk tried to settle this by asking to buy California and getting Mexico to agree on the Rio Grande. Mexico refused. Polk sends troops to the Rio Grande. Mexican troops cross the river. Game on. Mexican-American War is on. This is the first time that we really start to see the prowess of the American military, because even though they were outnumbered in every single major battle, they won every single battle. And in just 2 years, they marched into Mexico City and forced a treaty in 1848 that ended up ceding all our parts of what today is California, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, the entire Southwest, and into the northern part of the West, doubling America in size, second only to the Louisiana Purchase. Meanwhile, in 1846, he's also acquired Oregon from Great Britain. Iowa's become the 29th state. And then in 1848, even though everybody thinks about it as the 49ers, but in 1848, gold is discovered, which exploded Western expansion the following year in 1849 with the gold rush. So as the decade came to an end, for the first time now, America's borders truly stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And we've done this, by the middle of the 1850s, about 75 years after the beginning, after we became a country in the first place. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show here, a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50 with Bob Furr filling in for Marc. And we are walking our way through we've just walked our way through the 1840s. And now we're looking to move into the next chapter, into the 1850s. Now, Polk's an interesting president. His expansion of the country is equal only to Jefferson, maybe even exceeds Jefferson. He adds 1,000 square miles. He's also the first dark horse political candidate. Polk fulfilled every single campaign promise that he made during his campaign. Every single thing he said he was going to do, he did it in a single term. He lowered taxes. He established the U.S. Treasury. He also kept his promise to leave after one term. And those are all great things. But we also look back and see how his expansionism really ignited the slavery debate. And it really set the country on a path toward the Civil War. And by the way, back to trying to stay alive after doing all these great things. He retires to Tennessee. 2 months later, dies of cholera. So, just staying alive. If you look at letters at the time, they always start with, "I hope this finds you well and wishing you good health," because the chances that person might die between the next time you wrote to them was pretty good. So now the 1840s is a time of political upheaval, social change, all of it enabled by technology. 1844, you have the first telegraph message between Washington and Baltimore. That changes the speed of communication. I mean, think about back in the days when, it took weeks, right, the post office and stuff like that. The first sewing machine. Now, you wouldn't think about that as revolutionary, but everybody wears clothes, and now we've completely changed the way that clothes are being made. There's a whole new wave of new Americans coming into this country because of social upheaval in Germany and a potato famine in Ireland. So many immigrants come from those two countries that it really starts to reshape the demographics of the United States. Canals, steam-powered railways, rapidly expanding mobility, steamboats. We're now able to move people and goods around this country in ways that were unimaginable to the founding fathers.
Does the railroad come into this?
We're not transcontinental, but they're all independent businesses now and all going in different directions. But you are moving goods and people by rail for sure, So now you have the westward expansion is continuing as well. You've got cultural changes happening. The very first push for women's rights takes shapes with the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, as women start together and say, hey, all men are created equal. How about us? Even what's her name? Abigail Adams had written to John Adams during the Continental Congress. Remember the ladies, right? So now the ladies are like, hey, we're playing a part in this as well. And so now. Then Frederick Douglass releases his autobiography, and here is this well-spoken, articulate African-American former slave, and this book becomes wildfire. And now the slavery debate, especially with Texas coming into the Union and all those new territories coming to the Union in the 1840s, things are really, really coming to a head. Mm-hmm. So now we're in the 1850s. And the march to civil war has begun. I mean, this decade, we just consistently go down the path closer and closer toward war, fueled by this continued expansion. There's great migration across the Oregon Trail is continuing. The push for the transcontinental railroads that you mentioned is underway. We have another short-lived presidency that started a lot of this. General Zachary Taylor, who had been a hero of the Mexican-American War, known as Old Rough and Ready, another outsider, had no political experience. His presidency relied on a nonpartisan cabinet, so something Lincoln did later, the team of rivals. He had a nonpartisan cabinet, and he avoided Congress at all costs. Let me just avoid Congress. He supported New Mexico in a border dispute with Texas, and he even threatened to send military forces against Texas if it tried to occupy the land in New Mexico. Now, that's significant, right? This is the first U.S. president asserting federal authority, saying, I'll send U.S. troops to work out this state debate that's going on between these two. And there's another precursor that's interesting in this period of history, and that is Taylor signs a treaty with England where both countries pledge that neither will try to control any future Central American canal. So kind of an interesting precursor there. Now, he was an interesting guy. He was a Southerner, a plantation owner, but at the same time, he was fiercely committed to preserving the Union. He broke a deadlock with California and New Mexico, because of the deadlocks trying to get new states in. He told them, look, just skip the territorial stage, get your own constitutions, and apply for statehood immediately. And so, as these new free states came into play, now Southern leaders are threatening secession for the first time. They threatened secession in 1850. We're 10 years before the war. And former General Zachary Taylor, hero of the Mexican-American War, threatens that he will personally lead an American army into the South, where he will personally hang any of the Southern leaders who are fomenting this, attempt to overthrow the country. So Taylor might have been the person to change the trajectory of the country heading towards civil war at the most critical time. He might have been our last chance. He dies of stomach illness because he drinks a combination of iced water, milk, and cherries on a hot July 4th day, gets ill, and dies days later, right? So that concoction takes out the guy who might have prevented the American Civil War. So guess what we're going to talk about when we get back? We're going to be talking about that defining moment in American history here on the Marc McMain Show. Bob Furr filling in for Mark. We're going to get to that cataclysmic moment in American history after a few less threatening commercials.
The Madison Trolley Company is Morgan County's newest 5-star attraction. We offer historic Madison tours year-round, a haunted history experience in the fall, and our Madison Lights Christmas Tour and Mary Maddie Express Adventure for kids have become new holiday traditions. Our private charters add vintage charm to weddings and special occasions aboard a historic trolley by day, party trolley by night. Find us on the Madison Town Square or get on board by visiting madisontrolley.com or calling us at 706-997-1800.
Roll-Off Systems of Statham, they're on a roll. They offer dumpsters in all sizes, trash compactors, porta potties, and new combo cans. Existing sites are new building sites. Trash and waste disposal, it's their business. Locally owned and operated. Call Roll-Off Systems today. 770-725-ROLL. That's 770-725-ROLL. Or go to rolloffsystems.com.
If you like Brian Kemp, you're going to love Rick Jackson.
Rick Jackson's been a good supporter of mine. He's got a great story. I've kind of felt like for really 2 years now that race is right for political outsiders, especially somebody that could sell fun.
Rick Jackson, a conservative outsider who will make Georgia proud, just like Brian Kemp.
I'm Rick Jackson. Brian Kemp wins big for Georgia. Record jobs, teacher pay raises, and when Hollywood liberals tried to boycott Georgia, Kemp never backed down.
The conservative outsider, just like Kemp.
As governor, I'll slash property taxes and lead America in job creation. I'm Rick Jackson. Like Governor Kemp, I'll fight for Georgia and win big.
Rick Jackson's been a good supporter of mine. He's got a great story.
Early voting is now open. Runoff election Tuesday, June 16th. Paid for by Rick Jackson for Governor Incorporated.
When it comes to tasty treats, the only place you need is Stone Mountain Pecan Company. Enjoy fresh, high-quality Georgia pecans along with a huge selection of your favorite nuts like almonds, cashews, walnuts, pistachios, and Brazilian nuts. Plus delicious mixes, dried fruits, candies, and Southern Pecan coffee. Stone Mountain Pecan has it all. And the best part, it's all online at stonemountainpecan.com or visit our country store on Highway 78 in Monroe. Stone Mountain Pecan Company. Something for everyone. Eat well, be happy.
And welcome back, folks, to the Marc McMain Show here on 92.3. Bob Furr filling in for Mark, covering a special series, 5 parts. This is part 2 of Tuesday's 250 by 50s, leading into the big America 250 July 4th celebration coming up. And we have just lost President Zachary Taylor to a stomach illness after suffering, I guess, what would be called food poisoning. And a guy named Millard Fillmore takes office. He immediately abandons Taylor's firm stance against, checks and balances and all that. He signs the Missouri Compromise, the famous Missouri Compromise of 1850. What that does is it brings California in as a big, influential, and free state. But at the same time, as a bone that it throws to the slavery faction, it signs the Fugitive Slave Act, which says that, any person, even if they make it to free soil, has to be returned to the Confederacy. Then in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that makes slavery personal to people. They're like, hold on a second. This is not just in the abstract anymore. These are people. This is how they're being treated. It is an explosive bestseller, and it galvanizes the abolitionist movement. Now, while this is going on, we got the rest of the world to deal with, right? And so Fillmore also signs a treaty that for the very first time successfully opens trade with isolationist Japan, right? So while we're marching ourselves towards civil war, the motions are in essence for a world war coming down the road later. He also supported infrastructure growth, the Continental Railroad, and he firmly upheld the Monroe Doctrine in the Pacific. So this is where you start to see us getting that footprint in the Pacific. But because of the Fugitive Slave Act, the Whigs, the Northern faction, turned on him. He was denied a second term by his party, and it shattered the Whig Party. In fact, he was the last member of the Whig Party to be a president. So in 1853, Franklin Pierce becomes the 4th president. He's called a Northern Democrat, and he's a Northerner, but he caters to Southern interests. He's best known for the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed free states would decide whether or not they were going to be free or slave. And the battleground for that was Kansas and Nebraska, and pro and anti-slavery people poured into the states, and boom, you get bleeding Kansas, which is basically a proxy guerrilla war, a foreshadowing for what is to come, which is the war over slavery issue dividing the country. Now, in 1854, there's a new party made up of former Whigs, anti-slavery people, that gain a lot of Northern support, and they're called the Republicans. Siding with the Southern Democrats had alienated people against Fillmore, and so he fails to get his own party's nomination. And his policies really accelerated the divide between North and South. So while Taylor might have saved us from the Civil War, Pierce pushed us toward it, and he's largely considered one of the least effective presidents in U.S. history as a result. Along comes James Buchanan, who says, "Hold my beer," as far as ineffective presidents go, right? He's elected in 1857. Now, the first Republican candidate was in that election and won 16 northern states. So here's your precursor coming. Days later, in 1857, the Dred Scott decision comes down for the Supreme Court, which basically says African Americans have no rights. Whether they're free or enslaved, they're not citizens. They have no rights. It also says the Congress has no authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. And so Buchanan, throughout his presidency, it's appeasement, right? He tries to appease the South. The more he does, he enrages the North. Then during his presidency, the Panic of 1857, the first severe depression we would suffer, massive unemployment, business failures, lots of suffering, especially in the North, right? So now the North is getting more and more fired up about the way things are going in this country. Meanwhile, in 1858, there's a fight underway for an Illinois Senate seat. The incumbent, Stephen Douglas, is being challenged by a mostly unknown Springfield lawyer by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And they engage in a series of debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln loses the election, but he is so articulate in his anti-slavery position that the Republican Party is now built around that he gains national attention. Now, meanwhile, while all this is happening, like the nonstop tide of America pushing west, Minnesota becomes the next state in 1858. Oregon joins the Union in 1859. And then in 1859, a man in history who I once was heard referred to as the Meteor, John Brown, conducts John Brown's raid in Kansas. Buchanan sends federal troops to break it up under a commander, up-and-comer in the Union Army named Robert E. Lee, who puts down the rebellion. Brown is executed. He becomes a martyr. And, now things have really hit an intense period of disagreement. You're listening to the Marc McMain Show. Bob Furr filling in for Mark here with a special series called Tuesdays 250 by 50s on Real Country 92.3. And now it's 1860, and the Democratic Party, fractured over the slavery issue, runs 3 candidates in the election against Lincoln. They obviously split the vote. Lincoln is elected the first Republican president of the United States. Southern states begin seceding before he even takes office. Buchanan had declared that secession was illegal, so Buchanan's still in office, right? So he declares secession illegal, but at the same time says he has no constitutional authority to make the South stay. So just talking out of both sides of his mouth here. His cabinet members are resigning as the nation's collapsing. The nation's headed for war. He just remains passive. He's just watching it all unfold. Now, he's actually the one who sent reinforcements to Fort Sumter the first time. But when that ship got fired on, he just turned it around, and he basically just said, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to leave all this to my successor. And he ended up spending the rest of his life trying to defend his actions on the road to civil war. So now it's the end of the 1850s. We're on the eve of war. And the similarities and differences in this country, traceable all the way back to the colonial settlers, are really clear. In the South, cotton is king. Right? In 1790, the production of cotton in the entire South was only 3,000 bales if you put it all together. By 1860, it's 4 million bales. Cotton exceeds all other American exports combined. King cotton is an industry bigger than all other American businesses, railroads, and industries combined. And cotton accounts for more than half of the entire nation's gross domestic product. I don't think people realize how big cotton was. And it's just not an American thing. British textile mills, their economy is now completely dependent on cotton, which is, of course, dependent on slavery. Meanwhile, in the North, industrialization is underway. Large waves of job-seeking Irish and German immigrants are coming to the country. But for the most part, on the eve of the Civil War, most Americans still live on farms, living living in seasonal rhythms around the seasons and the weather. Everyday life is labor intensive. You're cooking over an open hearth. You're hand sewing your clothing. You're hauling water by hand. There's no plumbing or electricity. All that is about to change with the Civil War. Now, the Civil War is too big a topic to cover. It really, I could do a 5-part series on that alone. Shelby Foote, one of my favorite quotes about the Civil War, once said that everything that happened in American history before the Civil War led up to it. And everything that happened after the Civil War was a result of it. And another interesting thing about the Civil War is prior to the Civil War, when people talked about the United States, they referred to it as the United States are, meaning we were still seen as a collection of individual states. But after the war, it became the United States is. That was when, so it was truly the defining moment in American history. So rather than get into the war and all the rest of it, I want to just address one thing, and that is, what was it about, or what caused it, or what started it, or why did people fight it? And the problem that I've always seen with that question, Paul, is that people try to answer it with one answer. When it's not one question, it's 4 questions with 4 different answers. Question number 1, what was the Civil War about? It was about a different vision for what America was supposed to be between North and South. Different cultures, different religions, different economies, different views on individual liberties, where the power should lie. It was just very much, the Civil War was about 2 different visions for what America should be. What caused the Civil War? Slavery. If you try to make it about states' rights or anything else, you're not reading the history books. The documents, the speeches, the words of the time, clearly point to slavery as being the cause of the war. States' rights mattered because of slavery. The economy mattered because of slavery, right? At the end of the day, the Civil War caused slavery. What started it? Well, you could look at that as either invasion of the North by the South, right? Whether you call that the South firing on the troops in Fort Sumter that they had claimed as Southern territory, or the very first invasion of Virginia. It wasn't until after Fort Sumter that I think 4 of the 11 states actually joined it. So if what started it, that's Fort Sumter and the invasion. The most interesting question to me, though, is why it was fought. And the answer is it was fought by all different people for all different reasons, and those reasons changed over time. Some cared about slavery, some didn't. Some was about secession, some weren't. It was about all different things by all different people over all different times. And that's really the complexity of the Civil War, and that's as far as I want to get into it on today's show. So now war's over, right? 1865, effectively Lee's surrender to Appomattox ends the war. It's not until August 1866 that Alexander Stephens finally surrenders and the war is officially over. But while that ended slavery in this country, it started a new fight, because for the next 100 years, African Americans in the South would have to fight for their rights and individual protections under the Constitution as American citizens. So now, after the war, free of distraction, the push west is on like never before. It had continued. Now it's in earnest. During the war, we didn't stop, right? Kansas, 1861, West Virginia, 1863, Nevada, 1864. While the South is fighting to survive, the North is adding states. In 1862, the Homestead Act had promised 160 acres of land to anyone willing to farm it and improve it. And so now you have waves of people after the war going to take advantage of that. And in 1867, the U.S. purchases Alaska for Russia for $7.2 million. It was thought to be such a bad deal at 2 cents an acre that they called it Seward's Folly. And of course, we found out that worked out to be a pretty good deal. And then in 1867, Nebraska becomes the 37th state. And then at the end of the decade, to your question earlier, in 1869, in a major moment at Promontory Point, Utah, the first transcontinental railroad is combined. And now those Atlantic and western borders of the U.S. are truly connected. This is also the period, and we'll get into this on the next episode, where we see the rise of cities in the North and robber barons. We're really now, for the first time in American history, starting to see the cost of unchecked growth and expansion, precursors to things that would come later, like the Dust Bowl. In 1870, Rockefeller formed Standard Oil, the robber barons really starting to impact American society. In 1871, the Chicago fire happens. A third of the city burns down. 300 people are killed. That very same day in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, 1.2 million acres burned, and between 1,500 and 2,500 people died in that fire. And so,
Now, was it Mrs. O'Leary's cow that started that
I don't
fire?
think there's any truth to that at all. But what this is pointing to is you have the urban centers, uncontrolled growth, Chicago fire, and we're basically raping the land. There's where the Peshtigo fire comes into play. But in 1872, recognizing this, Yellowstone becomes our first national park. Now, to just finish out the last couple of years, in 1873, we have the Panic of 1873, a precursor to the Great Depression. 1874, women's temperance movement, precursor to the Prohibition. Massachusetts passes a law limiting the workday to 10 hours for women, precursor to the labor movement. 1875, the Civil Rights Act passes public accommodations. It gets overturned, precursor to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And we finish the decade with fun in 1875, the very first Kentucky Derby. Thanks for listening to Mark McMain Show. Bob for filling in for Mark. Tune in next Tuesday for the next chapter of America's Story on Tuesdays 250 by 50. Take care.